Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to NAUI's Dive Team Report. I'm your host, Greg Martin. You know, being a certified diver can be just a weekend hobby. It can be a vacation bonus, but it can also be an incredible job opportunity, a great vocation. Everything from owning a dive shop to being a teacher or many other avenues that you can follow. The one that's always, though, seemed to capture the imagination of everybody out there is that of a treasure hunter. And we've all heard stories about people finding treasure chests filled with gold doubloons and jewels. And there's been many movies and books and things written about that. That could be a once-in-a-lifetime type of thing. But finding a different kind of treasure can be very rewarding. The treasure, I consider, is history. Fritz Hanselmann with the Research Facility and the Chief Underwater Archaeologist Diving Program Director for the Meadows Center for Water and Environment at Texas State University, and soon a new job, I understand, is the Director of the Center's Underwater Archaeology and Exploration Initiative. Did I get all that right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a mouthful, but you got it right.
But you're getting ready to transition into a new position, I understand.
Yes, I will be moving actually this coming week to Miami, where I'll be directing a program in underwater archaeology and underwater exploration with the Rosenstiel School for Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Miami.
Bottom line, you're an underwater archaeologist. And what does that mean?
It means a number of things. First, it means I have a lot of fun. And I get to do a lot of really neat and unique things, including international travel, diving in places where people don't normally get to dive. And I also get to have a personal connection with our past and to really interact with that and to make new discoveries and find new things out and see if we can't rewrite history in some form or fashion. And so those are kind of two of the big aspects of being an underwater archaeologist, having fun and learning new things and acquiring new information that can fill in gaps in history or tell us something new that we don't know.
It's that treasure. And I was speaking with some guys over the weekend, and they were talking about doing treasure hunting. And I kind of probably furrowed my brow and had a quizzical look on my face. And they're like, no. We're talking about old bottles. Sometimes we find old bottles, and sometimes we find, little bits and pieces. And that was treasure to them. And that kind of is, I think, what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think everybody has their own sense of treasure. And that's a good point that you bring up, and one that is a big ethical difference between your typical treasure hunter, which basically is somebody that's selling artifacts for commercial gain, and an underwater archaeologist, which is a scientist who's out to acquire data, and none of it is for commercial gain. Artifacts aren't sold, they're studied, they're exhibited, et cetera, et cetera. So there are varying degrees in personal beliefs of what treasure is. I'm with you. The history is the treasure. The artifacts are the treasure. It's not the commercial gain or the profit that can be made from the sale of our past.
Talk about getting into archaeology as an underwater type of thing.
Yeah, archaeology is a process. And so basically, before we go into the field, there are a number of things that we have to do. And we have to look at what kind of work we're going to do. Are we going to just do a geophysical survey to have an idea of what's there? Or are we going out for excavation? Typically, anytime that we're excavating and anytime that we plan to recover any artifacts, we have to have a conservation plan for what happens after the recovery of the artifacts, so that the artifacts are treated and they don't break down and they don't decompose. Because a lot of times, as soon as you remove them from the ocean, where they've been in a state of equilibrium with the environment, they want to decompose, especially organic artifacts. Even iron artifacts, they go back to their natural state, rust and fall apart. And sometimes you hit it big and you find a shipwreck, and sometimes you don't.
How did you wind up transitioning into this, from being a diver into being an archaeologist?
Well, that's a good question. I'll see if I can give you the abridged version.
Okay.
I first started swimming when I was 3, and I grew up spending a lot of time in the Gulf of Mexico with my grandparents and my family. My grandfather would put golf balls into dress socks and throw them out for me to free dive down and grab and swim back to the surface. And I loved all things aquatic. So I devoured the reruns of Jacques Cousteau. And then, interestingly, I found out about Clive Cussler, so I read some of his books. And then I found in high school that underwater archaeology was actually a field and a career. And so freshman year of college, I wrote my first term paper on Bronze Age shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, pretty much because those were the only books that they had at the library that talked about shipwrecks scientifically. And then I was sold. The biggest hurdle, I think, was convincing my father that it was a viable career move.
Talk a little bit about what young divers should do, people that are getting into the diving industry, that maybe this sounds good to them and they want to pursue this as a course. What do you suggest for them?
I get asked that a number of times. The advice I would have is, one, make sure you have a really good fundamental skill set as far as a diver. So make sure you have your trim stability points you can control locked in, because it's the same principle with a coral reef. You don't want to be dragging your console or your gauge or kicking through a pristine underwater marine environment as much as you would not want to put your fins down on 3rd century BC Byzantine amphora on a shipwreck, or break an artifact on a 17th century Spanish wreck, et cetera, et cetera. So the better control of your diving that you have, the easier it becomes to be task loaded underwater and say, okay, well, I'm going to measure and map this, or I'm going to document this, or take a picture or video of this. And you can hover there and just do it. So the diving becomes second nature. So that would be my first piece of advice, is really lock down the fundamental dive skills so that you achieve that level of comfort and control in the water. Second piece of advice would be to, if you're into it, you really need to be into maritime history and kind of anthropology as a field, the study of people. That's one of the things that we look at a lot, is how do we interpret sites? If you find a site, what exactly does it mean? We could give a list of really neat, cool artifacts, but the question is, how do we learn from those artifacts? What was going on with them? How are people using them? What does this site mean in the larger context of its historical time period? Third piece of advice is try to find skills in addition to diving and archaeological background that could be applicable elsewhere, but also to archaeology. One of the things that has helped me, I happen to be fluent in Spanish. That really helped jumpstart my career with projects and being in the field internationally. There's a number of other skill sets that aren't necessarily diving, and they're not specifically archaeological, but they definitely play a large role in what we do.
You mentioned early on, kind of going into this, finding Clive Cussler, and Clive has this way of asking the what if questions. What if, this particular happened? What if they raised the Titanic, and that kind of thing? And they're always these kind of bigger than life sort of situations. Is there one for you? Is there the Mount Everest? Is there the Titanic for you that you would like to discover?
I have a laundry list, and I'll give you a couple. The first one is I would love to find one of Henry Morgan's ships that he lost off the coast of Panama in 1671. We've been searching for them for a number of years. And in the course of our search, we found a number of guns, cannons that we think came from the ships, but we have yet to find the ships themselves. And we also found a Spanish merchant ship that sank in 1681, 10 years after Morgan lost his ships in 1671, which is really a phenomenally preserved colonial Spanish shipwreck that we've been documenting for the last few years. So I would love to find one of Morgan's lost ships in Panama. And going back to what we talked about briefly regarding treasure, I would like to find a galleon or something that people could argue has commercial value, but use it to highlight the historical value, to keep the collection intact and not have anything sold for commercial gain. And then have a traveling museum exhibit that would show this to everybody so that people can see it. I mean, that's what is really cool about archaeology, is it makes history tangible. You're actually looking at or touching or interacting with the physical remains of the past.
Anybody who is looking at the idea maybe now that they'd like to jump into this, get good instruction. That's if you're not a diver now and you're looking at getting into this, get the best instruction you possibly can. And as like Fritz said, hone in those skills. Make that second nature. Wish you the best of luck. I appreciate you spending some time chatting with us this morning.
Thank you, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
If you would like more information about diving, be sure and visit the NAUI website, naui.org. And that's this episode of NAUI's Dive Team Report. I'm your host, Greg Martin. Thanks for listening. I'll see you underwater.